Okay, hi everyone. I hope this finds you in good health and good spirits. So in today's lesson, we're going to continue transitioning the knowledge and skills that we developed with the MS-20 into VCV Rack, and we'll be talking about VCAs, EGs, and VCFs in VCV Rack. Lots of letters there. So just like last time, I'll try to cover some new ground today, talk about some things we haven't already talked about as we move our way through VCV Rack. So with regard to VCAs, we're going to talk about amplitude modulation, the difference between attenuators and attenuverters. We'll talk a little bit more about the difference between gates and triggers when we talk about envelope generators. And we'll talk a little bit about noise today. We know all about pink noise and white noise, but there's a veritable rainbow of other colors of noise that we haven't discussed, so we'll look at some of those today. With regard to filters, we'll talk a little bit about filter slope and drive, some things we haven't covered before. And then we'll end by talking about some third-party modules and building a patch in the quote-unquote wrong order. So let's start with a VCA. So the fundamental VCA is right here. Let me pull that up. And we know VCAs as being voltage-controlled amplifiers, but you may remember early in the semester I mentioned that most VCAs in practice don't actually amplify sounds. They don't make sounds louder. They're really attenuators. They're voltage-controlled attenuators. They make signals softer, weaker. They reduce the voltage of a signal. And that's exactly what the VCA here in VCV Rack does. And let's look at that with a sawtooth oscillator. So I'm going to send the sawtooth into this amplifier, and the output I'm going to send to our scope. And you can see a sawtooth wave like we're accustomed to seeing. And as I drag down on this green slider, you can see that we're making that signal weaker. We're making it softer, and then if we drag it all the way down to the bottom, we've completely muted the signal. And so we're scaling the signal. When it's all the way up, we're just letting the original signal pass through. Anything less than that, and we're attenuating a little bit. And you can hear that if we send this into our mixer here. It's effectively just a volume slider. So this VCA is going to reduce the strength of our voltages. We can use it to attenuate volume, just like we're doing here. There's a CV input here, which allows the VCA to be shaped and modulated by different things. We're going to look at that here in just a sec. And there's also a linear or exponential knob that we can switch to switch this between responding to a linear scaling of voltage and an exponential scaling of voltage. We're going to stick with linear for the most part today. Exponential you could use to make your envelopes or modulation seem a little more exaggerated, a little more dramatic, but I won't be messing with that today. But let's do a little bit of modulation here. So I'm going to grab an LFO, and let's send a sine wave into our VCA. And now we're doing some amplitude modulation where the LFO is modulating the amplitude, the volume of our signal. And you can see the volume moving up and down on the slider there, but you can also see that it's still scaled a little bit by this VCA. I can open it up all the way. We've got a much wider range in our volume here, or I can scale it down to where we were, and our amplitude is modulating through a narrower range. And of course, in the LFO, I can make this slower or faster. Now, this is amplitude modulation. The musical term for amplitude modulation is tremolo. And the cool thing about amplitude modulation and tremolo is that if we were to do this faster, if we were to do audio rate amplitude modulation, has kind of a familiar sound. I'm going to do that again with a square wave LFO and see if it sounds like anything that we did on the MS-20s. So if you're thinking ring modulation, you're right. This is actually how we get ring modulation. Ring modulation is effectively amplitude modulation that's happening so fast it's happening at audio rate speeds. So to show you this, let's do this with some sine waves. And I'm going to send this into our analyzer here. And right now, we've just got a sine wave that is having a little bit of tremolo. The volume is being scaled back and forth. And let's make this a little higher. And if you remember, in ring modulation, we've got sum tones and difference tones. And so as I gliss this LFO up into higher and higher audio rate frequencies, on this analyzer, you're going to see a sum tone getting higher and higher, and a difference tone getting lower and lower. There they go. Scale it down a little bit and see the same thing. So these two tones we see on either side of our sine wave are the sum tone and the difference tone. And we only see one of each since we're only working with the sine wave. But if we were to do this with a sawtooth wave, there's actually a lot of sum tones and difference tones in there. So the VCA can also be used to shape modulation. So let's rearrange this patch, and instead of using the VCA for amplitude modulation, we're going to use the VCA to scale the LFO when it's doing frequency modulation. We're going to listen to our triangle wave here. Whoops. And we're going to send our LFO in to do some frequency modulation, but before we do, we're going to stop off at the VCA so we can attenuate this frequency. And let's go ahead and turn up our FM knob. So we hear this pretty dramatic frequency modulation. It's moving from middle range pitch to a very, very high pitch. But we can scale that down by moving through our VCA. I can show this on the scope here. So you can see as we increase the as we have the full volume LFO, we have a really wide range. As we narrow that range, we're moving through a much narrower range of pitches in our frequency modulation. Now you might remember from last time, that's actually exactly what this FMCV knob does. So if I open this all the way up, but then I start scaling this knob, it's doing the exact same thing. That's because this FMCV knob is an attenuator. It's attenuating the signal that comes in here. So whatever comes in here is going to be attenuated by this knob. It's going to be down to 0. As we open it up, that signal gets stronger and stronger. So doing this with the VCA module is effectively just doing the exact same thing as this. So it's kind of unnecessary. While we're talking about this, one thing I forgot to mention last time is that in VCO2, let's turn that off for a sec. VCO2 we mentioned does not have a volts per octave knob. So whereas VCO1 has this volts per octave knob we can use for a keyboard voltage coming in, the VCO2 doesn't. It's only got the FM knob. However, if we did have a keyboard voltage coming in, we could send that to the FM knob and just make sure that our attenuator is opened all the way. And now this will function just like a volts per octave knob. So that's me playing the keyboard and this oscillator responding as we would hope. Let's now talk about the difference between attenuators and attenuverters. An attenuator, we've been talking about, is just something that's going to reduce the strength of a voltage. An attenuverter, however, does this, but a little bit more. Attenuverter is a portmanteau of the words attenuator and inverter. So it attenuates and it inverts. We just kind of push those two words together. So an attenuverter can attenuate a signal down to 0 volts, down to where we're not hearing anything. But it can actually go beyond that and can invert a signal into a negative voltage. So to do that, let's look at another module called 8vert, which is in the fundamental modules, and it's literally just 8 attenuverters all stacked against each other, and you can use them for all sorts of different things. So I'm going to take this sawtooth LFO, send that into our attenuverter, and then send it out into our scope. And right now we don't see anything at all. And that's because this attenuverter is at 0. And attenuverters are typically at 0 when they're at 12 o'clock, when they're centered there. And as we bring this, you notice there's a minus on the left and a plus on the right. As we bring this into the positive range, you'll see that we start to see a sawtooth on our scope. And as we get higher and higher and higher, we eventually see the full sawtooth. So this is just an attenuator on the right side. As we move in the clockwise direction, we're getting an attenuator all the way open, and we get our full volume sawtooth, full strength. And as we close it and move back towards 12 o'clock, back towards the center, we have a weaker and weaker sawtooth until finally at 12 o'clock, at 0 there, we don't have a sawtooth at all. It's been totally muted. But then as we move to the left, as we move counterclockwise, we're going to start to invert that signal. And instead of having a positive going sawtooth in positive voltage, we start to have a negative going sawtooth in negative voltage. And when I open my attenuverter all the way to the left, now we've got this negative going sawtooth. Instead of going from 0 up to positive 10, it's going from 0 down to negative 10. So that's what an attenuverter does, is it attenuates, but it can also invert the signal and flip it around, which is cool for things like sawtooth waves, because you can take what was a positive going sawtooth wave and end up with a negative going sawtooth wave. Although here, it's not just changing direction, it's also changing its voltage range. It was going 0 to 10, now it's going negative 10 to 0. All right, so now we're going to transition and start talking about envelope generators. But before we do, let's talk a little bit more about the difference between gates and triggers. So triggers, as we mentioned last time, have no duration. They're just a 1 millisecond burst of 10 volts. So, and they're used to trigger instantaneous events. So let's look at this in VCV Rack, and I'm going to show this by using another new module called the pulses module. And the pulses module is literally just a module that, as we tap these little buttons, will send different triggers and gates to different modules. So I'm going to take a blue cable for trigger, send that into our scope, and then as I tap, you can see on the oscillator or oscilloscope, there's just a little burst that comes up. And that shows us that a trigger is literally just a 1 millisecond, sometimes they don't even show up, a 1 millisecond burst of 10 volts that, and once I hit that button, it's there, and then it's gone just as fast as it was there. Gates, on the other hand, do have duration. They're 10 volts just like the triggers, except they're going to last. They're going to be sustained for as long as I hold this button down. So if I switch over to the gate output, now as long as I hold that button, that gate will be sustained. And when I let go, we go back down to 0 volts. So here's a gate, it's sustaining, stop, I let go. Here's another one, stop, another stop. So as long as I'm holding that tap button down, that gate's going to be sustained and it will have this longer duration. And gates can be used for all kinds of things, but the most common thing that we do with them is to use them to start and end ADSR envelopes. Now, as I turn these gates on and off, if you look at them on the scope there, what do you notice it kind of looks like? If you're saying a pulse wave or a square wave, you're absolutely right. So instead of using this pulses module that's going to force me to keep tapping that button, I'm just going to grab an LFO and send the square wave to our scope here. And sure enough, that looks just like what we were looking at before, except it's a little more regular. All our gates are the same length now instead of just lasting however long I hit that button. But that's going to free up my hands a little bit, so I'm going to use this LFO to produce some gates for us for the next couple minutes here. So now let's add an envelope generator. So I'm going to grab this ADSR module from our fundamentals here. And this ADSR module should look pretty familiar to us. It's got our 4 envelope parameters: attack, decay, sustain, release. They're in order. Also, each one of these has its own CV input, its own control voltage input, so we could actually modulate or modify the attack time, the sustain level, etc., with different controls. So for instance, I could send an LFO to my sustain level and give us some kind of amplitude modulation that's part of our envelope. Or I could even send, I don't know, something weird like send a volts per octave to the attack time, so that really low notes have very short attack times and really high notes have very long attack times. I'm not going to mess with any of that stuff right now, though. You'll also notice that there are these little lights next to each parameter here, and that's going to show us our progress as we move through our envelope. And to see that, we're going to have to connect something to a gate. So let's go ahead and take our square wave that's producing all these gates, and we're going to connect it to the gate input of the envelope here. And now you can see that we're moving relatively quickly through all of these parameters here, through the attack, decay, sustain, release. And we're moving so quickly, in fact, that may be too fast. So I'm going to slow my LFO down a little bit. And now we can see our progress a little bit better. And then, of course, we've got an output, which will send the voltage from the envelope generator to wherever we're going. So let's go ahead and take the voltage there and send that into our scope as well. And so now, in addition to seeing our gates on the scope, you can also see our envelopes. And it has a nice envelope shape that we're used to seeing. We've got an attack that unfolds from when the gate starts, a decay that comes down from there, a sustain that continues until the gate ends, and then we've got a little bit of a release that's going to start there. So we can adjust our parameters some. So I'm going to make the release time a little longer. You can see here the release is a little longer than it was a second ago. Can make it a little longer still. Now it's so long that it's actually not having time to finish before our LFO gives us a new gate. So I'm going to make it a little less long. Has time to get all the way down there to the bottom. Let's make our attack time a little longer. So we can see there we've got a longer attack time coming down. And let's now adjust our sustain level. So I'm going to come down to a much lower sustain level now. You can see that there, sustaining right here now, or a much higher sustain level. So now we're sustaining closer to the top, closer to 10 volts there. Now our gates are being regularly produced by this LFO, and we can make these, of course, happen faster and slower. So let's make our gates happen a little faster. You'll see our envelopes are going to adapt in the same way. We don't have much sustain time now because by the time our envelope gets, our decay time is finished, we're basically done with our gate. Another thing that we can do with the LFO producing our gates is we can change the proportion of gate on to gate off. So right now it's a square wave, so we're spending the same time in the gate as we are out of the gate. But if I were to adjust my pulse width, I can make my gates narrower and put a little more space in between them. And I might have to give myself a little less attack and decay time. But we have a little room for a little more release now. And if I were to move my pulse width all the way to the left, then we start getting effectively a series of triggers instead of gates, because our pulse wave is now so short it's basically just on and off. And we're basically just getting an instantaneous attack and then a long release. So I'm going to go ahead and reset some of this stuff so we get just a normal envelope and a little bit longer gates. Okay, so as you know, we normally are going to use our envelope generator in conjunction with a VCA. So let's go ahead and set that up. We've got our VCA here. I'm going to send our output as the control input into the VCA, and immediately you can see that we're scaling up, jumping all the way to the top during the attack, coming down during the decay to our sustain level here, and then releasing at the end. And so you can follow the envelope in this green slider in the same way you can on the scope or through the lights that are moving through our envelope generator. And of course, our VCA can still control the range. So if I wanted my envelope to be a little softer, I can scale it down. Now my sustain level is down here. Or scale it back up. And so now let's actually use this to scale a sound. So I'm going to grab a VCO. We're going to use the triangle wave. Send that into our mixer. And then we're going to, actually before it goes into our mixer, we'll run it through the VCA, and then we'll come out to the VCA. Reduce our attack time. Give us a little more release. So you can see how all these different parameters are relating to what we hear. Now we're moving through this VCA. You'll notice when you open up Rack and you just look at that default patch that there's not actually one of these green VCA sliders. Instead, they're using this mixer module, and they're sending things into the mixer, and they're using the ADSR to scale the control voltage part of just that first channel on the mixer. And this is effectively the exact same thing as what we were doing a second ago. This first channel has its this volume slider, which is another VCA effectively. And so we can send a control voltage in there and scale that input with an envelope generator just like we were with this VCA. You can do the same thing with this Bog Audio mixer, except this one responds logarithmically, so when you do that, the envelopes are a little more dramatic. So I'm not going to mess with any of that right now. Let's go ahead and just go back to what we were doing with our VCA here. So our VCA and our envelope generator, we can also use them to scale other parameters too. So right now we're scaling volume, but we could of course, just like on the MS-20s, we could use this to scale the pitch of an oscillator. So I can take the output of my envelope generator here and send that to the FM input on this VCO. And then as I bring this knob up, this envelope is going to be mapped onto our volume through this VCA, but also to our pitch. So this FMCV knob is controlling how dramatic that envelope is, and it's kind of acting just like the EG1 knob on the MS-20 was, which controls how much of this envelope is applied to our oscillator. And we could likewise send this to some parameter of our LFO, or as we'll talk about shortly, something to do with our VCFs. So these envelopes can scale all kinds of things, not just volume. All right, so let's clear some of this stuff out. So let's take a brief little break here, and we're going to spend some time talking about noise. Now there's a noise generator that's not part of a VCO in the fundamental modules here, but it just is its own module, and it's just called noise. And here it is. And this noise module literally just has a bunch of outputs. It doesn't have a single parameter that we can vary. It's literally just a bunch of outputs. So I'm going to take the white noise out, which is this top outlet. I'm going to send that into our spectral analyzer and then out into our mixer. So we know all about white noise. We've talked about white noise before. White noise has equal energy at every frequency. And then there is pink noise here, which has equal energy in every octave. And we've talked about that distinction before. But another way that we can describe pink noise, which I'm not sure if I said this to you in the past, is that pink noise, in order to have equal energy in every octave, it has to kind of filter the noise out, and it does so by decreasing the energy at 3 dB per octave. So what that means is that, let's say we just randomly grab a frequency, say 1,000 hertz. Whatever the energy is at 1,000 hertz, an octave above that, 2,000 hertz, it's going to be 3 dB softer. An octave above 2,000, 4,000, it's going to be 3 dB softer than that. It's going to be 6 dB softer. So every frequency, no matter where you go in pink noise, an octave above that is going to be 3 dB softer, which is why you get this kind of scaled shape moving downward in the pink noise. But you can see here on the module, we've got lots of different types of noise, all these different colors. So let's pop down, listen to red noise. Red noise, you can see and hear, is scaled and filtered even more than pink noise. In red noise, the energy decreases at 6 dB per octave. This is also called Brownian noise because it uses a Brownian algorithm. It doesn't have anything to do with the color. It's called red noise because if you filtered light in this way, you would get the color red. But red noise is like pink noise, except it's got a much steeper curve. The energy is filtered at 6 dB per octave. Then we have a couple noise colors that are filtered in the opposite direction. So violet noise is the inverse of red noise. Here the energy increases at 6 dB per octave. So we don't have any low frequencies, and we're moving higher and higher as we go. Every octave we have 6 dB more energy. Blue noise is the inverse of pink noise. So here the energy increases at a rate of 3 dB per octave. So it's kind of the inverse of pink noise there. These last two are a little different. Gray noise is noise that's filtered according to equal loudness curves. So equal loudness curves are things that psychoacousticians use to measure how we hear, because our ears respond differently to different frequencies. There's some frequencies our ears are more sensitive to than others. So whereas pink noise, in theory, sounds flatter to our ears than white noise because there's equal energy in each octave, gray noise corrects this even more and says, yeah, but there's certain frequencies that our ears are more sensitive to than others. So if we make the frequencies that we're least sensitive to louder and the frequencies that we're most sensitive to softer, then we'll come up with something that really is flat, that really does sound flat to our ears. So gray noise is, at least in theory, the flattest sounding noise there is, where we really hear everything equally, low frequencies, middle frequencies, high frequencies. The last one, black noise, there's no real technical definition for black noise. Different noise generators do different things with black noise. In VCV Rack, black noise is just uniform noise. That is, it's white noise with aliasing. So a lot of early noise generators generated noise this way, producing what they called white noise then. We're calling black noise now. It's basically sounds the exact same as white noise, except there's a little bit of high frequency distortion due to aliasing. So it's not really useful for audio purposes, but it generates good random values for control voltage or sample and hold or other non-audio purposes. And just like we did in with the MS-20, we can use noise as a modulating source. So I can take an oscillator here, send maybe a sine wave to our, send a sine wave to our spectral analyzer. And then we can modulate that by sending some white noise into our FM input. Bring up our attenuator there. And now we're randomly modulating that frequency with the noise. Just like on the MS-20, it didn't sound particularly useful. It's kind of a cool thing, but maybe not so useful unless you're moving through a sample and hold, which we'll talk about next time. All right, so now let's talk about VCFs, voltage-controlled filters. So this is the VCV Rack fundamental filter. You'll notice it has two modes or two outputs, one that's a low-pass filter and one that is a high-pass filter. And then we've got this big cutoff frequency knob that works just like it did on the MS-20. So when we're in low-pass filter mode, the filter opens as we move clockwise. So it is as open as it's going to get when it's at all the way to the right, and it closes all the way as we move down to the left. If we were to switch to high-pass mode, when we're all the way open counterclockwise, the filter is open, and then it closes, attenuating the low frequencies as we move clockwise or move to the right. Now, one thing you'll notice with this filter is, let's go back to low-pass mode. Even if the filter is all the way open, if you look at our analyzer here, it still looks like the sound is being pretty filtered. And that's because our maximum cutoff frequency is 8,372 hertz. So it's not actually all the way open whenever we move this frequency knob all the way to the right. It's just as open as it's going to get. And unfortunately, it doesn't sweep the entire audio range. It only goes up to like 8,000 hertz. So that's something to keep in mind as you're using this filter, is that it's always filtering. It's always going to be attenuating some high frequencies, even if it's quote-unquote all the way open. In addition to this big cutoff frequency knob, we've also got a fine-tune knob, just like we have on our oscillators. And this is going to adjust the position of our cutoff frequency within a perfect fifth above or below what our big knob sets it as. And to hear that, let's go ahead and disconnect everything, and we're just going to listen to the filter itself. So to do that, let's add some resonance. We've got this resonance knob here. And just like on the MS-20, this filter self-oscillates. So if we bring that resonance knob all the way up, the filter is now producing a tone, which we can see on the analyzer there. And as we move this frequency knob, that pitch moves up and down. And this fine-tune knob will just adjust that even more precisely. And you can hear that it moves a perfect fifth above the center position and below, give or take. So in addition to the resonance knob being here, we also have a resonance input here, a resonance CV input. So you could send an LFO or something there to modulate the resonance to add more or less resonance. And then we also have a drive knob and a CV input for drive if we wanted to modulate it. So let's talk about what drive does. And to do that, let's send a sawtooth into our filter. We'll use a digital wave. So with our sawtooth, you'll notice that as we close the filter and we lose some of those higher harmonics, our signal gets a little weaker. It's not just getting less bright, but it's also getting actually softer. You can even see that on the scope here. When we're all the way open, we've got a pretty strong sawtooth wave, and then as we close the filter, the signal gets softer. So what this drive knob does, in a way, it does a couple things, but the first thing it does is it can kind of give us a little bit of a volume boost to help make up for this signal loss that comes from filtering out the highs. So we can make the signal a little louder. It doesn't make the signal all the way louder though, and if you notice, it's doing something else as we make things louder. Let's open the filter up a little bit. That as I make things louder with this drive, it's not simply getting louder, the waveform is actually changing shape a little bit. You'll notice it's kind of bending a little bit as I increase this drive knob. And rather than looking like a sawtooth, it's starting to bend and look a little bit like a triangle wave, or even a pulse wave or a square wave or something. And that's because it's doing something called clipping. So clipping is what a lot of distortion plugins or distortion circuits do, which is as a signal gets louder, they're going to kind of clip off the round tops of the waves, or pointy tops on a sawtooth, and it's going to make them look a little bit more like a pulse wave or a square wave. It's going to kind of chop those rounded edges off, pointed edges off, and you end up with something that's a little flatter, and that, as a result, is going to produce more overtones. You can see as we reduce our drive, we have fewer overtones, and as we increase it, there are more overtones and they're louder. Now, but if we look at the scope, it's not just flattening things. They don't actually look flat. They don't look like anything's been clipped off. And that's because this particular drive module here is doing something called soft clipping. So it's not doing a hard clip, a hard cutoff. It's actually giving things a little bit of a rounded edge. So they don't look perfectly like a square wave, but they're moving in that direction while still having some roundness to them. This doesn't add quite as many harmonics as hard clipping does. So let's go back and send some noise in here. And you'll notice, kind of like what we were talking about with the different types of noise, when we send noise through this filter, we can see this slope here. And all filters have a slope, have a certain level of steepness. Different filters can have slopes of different levels of steepness, and we measure this steepness in what are called poles. So for every pole, the filter is going to attenuate at 6 dB per octave. So once again, that means that, let's say our filter's cutoff frequency is 1,000 hertz. That means an octave above that, at 2,000 hertz, the energy will be 6 dB softer. An octave above that, at 4,000 hertz, it's going to be 6 dB softer still, so 12 dB softer, etc. So every octave we go, we're getting 6 dB softer. A 2-pole filter is going to be twice as steep. So it's going to attenuate at 12 dB per octave. And this is what we had on the Korg MS-20s. The Korgs had a 2-pole filter, actually two, the high pass and low pass, two 2-pole filters. So those filters attenuated at 12 dB per octave. So not super steep, because we also have 3-pole filters, which attenuate at 18 dB per octave, and 4-pole filters, which attenuate at 24 dB per octave. So a 4-pole filter is a lot steeper than, well, it's twice as steep as we had on the MS-20. And a 4-pole filter is actually really common in analog synthesis. So a 4-pole filter is what the very famous Moog filters were, and still are. And a 4-pole filter is also what we have here on the VCF in VCV Rack. Our fundamental VCF is a 4-pole filter. But you could have filters that are even more dramatic. An 8-pole filter, which attenuates at 48 dB per octave, and then a 12-pole filter, which would attenuate at 72 dB per octave. And once you get that high, once you get up to a 12-pole filter, it's effectively a brick wall. Like you have some slope, but you barely have any slope. You are attenuating so quickly that you don't have a lot of energy present above the cutoff frequency. So our filters can be shaped and modulated just like any of the other modules. So we can do cutoff frequency modulation with an LFO by sending it to this frequency input. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to send a sawtooth wave, maybe a nice low sawtooth, into our filter here. Maybe I'll add a little resonance. And then let's add an LFO. And we're going to send that into our frequency input. And now we're going to increase this frequency CV knob. And notice that we haven't done anything with this yet, but it's up at 12 o'clock. It's up in the center. And what does that suggest to you? What kind of control might this be? If you're thinking an attenuverter, you're correct. If you look at our VCO and LFO, the FMCV knobs are down at 0. So these are attenuators. They're going to start at 0, and then they're going to attenuate. From there. But our frequency CV is starting in the middle, which means it's an attenuverter. So as we move to the right, we start to hear that cutoff frequency modulation. And what's happening is as the LFO moves up and down, let's look at this LFO in the scope here. As the energy in this LFO increases, the position of the filter increases. So if this is off, our cutoff frequency is here. You can even add some resonance and see the cutoff right there. And then as we increase this attenuverter here, the LFO is going to push it higher into a positive value higher than where we set our frequency knob. If we move this knob to the left, counterclockwise, negative, what's going to happen is as our LFO moves higher in voltage, our cutoff frequency is actually going to move down. And so now we're moving into the negative area, lower than what our cutoff frequency was. So if we move this to the right, basically our LFO causes our cutoff frequency to move from where we've set it to higher levels. If we move this to the left, our LFO is going to move our cutoff frequencies from where we've set it down to lower levels and back. If we move it all the way down, the filter is going to close entirely and then open back up. And if we open it all the way, the filter is going to open entirely and then go down to where we've set the cutoff. Now, actually, all that depends on the fact that we have a unipolar LFO. If we have a bipolar LFO, which is actually going into positive and negative territory on its own, then this position of the attenuverter here doesn't make a difference. If we move it all the way up, we're going to have it opening all the way and closing all the way. And if we move it all the way negative, we get the exact same thing. So it matters that you're using a unipolar LFO if you want to get different results from this attenuverter. So we can do the same thing with an envelope generator. So let's go ahead and add an ADSR in here. And we'll actually leave our LFO here, and we're going to use our LFO to generate some gates for us. And we'll take a look at those in our scope. And then we're going to take the output of our ADSR and send that into our filter. And let's also send that into our scope so we can see that. And as we open our attenuverter here, the filter is going to open during the attack, come down during the decay, sit at whatever the sustain level is, and during the release, it's going to come back down to where we've set the cutoff frequency. If we move this in the opposite direction, then we get what we had on the MS-20 when we did that rev out from the envelope generator. We get that inverse envelope. So now it's actually going to close during the attack, open a little bit to the sustain level during the decay, and then during the release, it'll open all the way back up to where we've set the cutoff frequency. So as we move to the left, we get these inverted envelopes. As we move to the right, we get these positive envelopes where the filter opens. Okay, so I think we've pretty well covered what was happening here with the VCF. Of course, if you have questions, be sure to let me know via the discussion board in Blackboard. But now let's talk about some third-party modules. So I'm going to clear some of these out, and we're going to look at some third-party versions of some of the modules that we talked about today. So I'm going to start by looking at a third-party attenuator, and I would like to talk about this dual attenuverter from Bufaco. And what's cool about this is it's a regular attenuverter, kind of like that 8-vert module we looked at. Although unlike that 8-vert module, which had 8 inputs and outputs, this one has 2, hence the name dual attenuverter. It's got one attenuverter up here and then one down here at the bottom. So let's send a sawtooth into this, and we'll take a look at that on the scope down here. So right now we're seeing nothing because our attenuverter is set to 0. But if we want to see a positive sawtooth wave, we'll move this into the positive range, and we'll make this a little faster. There's our positive sawtooth, and as we move back to 0, it gets softer, and then as we move into the negative territory, we get our inverted sawtooth wave that's also in the negative territory. Now, we were talking before, like this would be handy because this can change our positive going sawtooths into negative going sawtooths, but it also changes the voltage range, which maybe is not so handy. However, this dual attenuverter here also has this offset knob, which is just going to add voltage to what we have here, thereby changing the range. So if I move this offset knob into the positive area, our sawtooth wave doesn't change shape, doesn't invert. It just moves higher in the voltage range. And if I push it all the way up where I'm adding 10 volts, now I have this negative sawtooth that's moving from 10 down to 0 instead of from 0 down to negative 10. So just to quickly undo that, if everything is at 0, we've got our signal muted. If our attenuverter is all the way positive, we get our positive going sawtooth. We're going to move that down to where it's all the way negative. Now we get a negative going sawtooth in the negative voltage range. And if we wanted that negative going sawtooth to be in the normal LFO unipolar range, then we just push that offset up. and it moves our LFO into the positive voltage range, which can be really handy if we wanted some slow LFO modulation that's moving downward. Pew, pew, pew. We could use this dual attenuverter to get that. Another third-party module we can look at is another VCF, this time the Bog Audio VCF. So I'm going to pull that up here, and then let's add some white noise to run through it. So this is a lot like the VCF that we were just looking at, the fundamental VCF, except the first thing you'll notice is that there's these little numbers around the cutoff frequency, and we can see right away that this cutoff frequency scales the full audio range. So we're down at 0 volts, the filter is entirely closed. We can open it all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And then we can see there on the analyzer, when it's all the way open, it's really all the way open. We're not actually filtering. It doesn't max out at 8,000 hertz like the other one. This one opens all the way up. So that's cool. In addition, we have these other modes. So we have a low-pass mode, a high-pass mode, just like we had on the other one. So we can open that up and close that high-pass filter as well. We also have 2 band filter modes. There's a band pass filter, which is going to filter everything out except a particular band. And when we first go to it, that band is incredibly narrow that we're only letting like a single frequency through. It almost sounds like it's self-oscillating, but it's not. We're filtering this white noise still, but we're filtering it using a band pass filter that's so narrow, we're just letting a single frequency through. We're just letting 5,000 hertz through. But you'll see we've got this knob that says res/BW. Res means resonance, so when we're in low pass or high pass mode, this is our resonance knob, our peak knob if we were on the MS-20. And BW stands for bandwidth. So when we're in band pass or band reject mode, this is the width of that band. So as we increase this, our band gets wider. And then we can use our cutoff frequency knob, which is actually now it's a center frequency, because when we're in band mode, the big knob here is not controlling the cutoff because there's 2 cutoffs in a bandpass filter. So this is actually setting what our center frequency is, what frequency exists in the middle of this band. So we can use this to change the position of our band and use the bandwidth knob to change how wide or narrow our band is. And then we've also got band reject mode, which is what it sounds like. It's like a reverse bandpass filter. We're letting everything through except for a certain band, and that band can be really narrow or really wide, and then our center frequency can be moved around as we move the band that we're cutting out up and down. Let's go back to low pass mode, add a little resonance there. And you can also see that it's got a slope knob, which is really handy. So here we can change the slope of our filter. So if we go down to 1, our filter has a really gradual slope. If we can go to set it to 2, which gives us the same slope we had on the MS-20. So if you really loved those MS-20 filters, you can get that sound here with the 2-pole filter. Up to 4 poles, and it'll sound like that other filter, the VCF fundamental module, or like a Moog filter. And then we can even go to steeper and steeper filters. We can go up to 8 or 12 poles, and then we have something, like I said earlier, that's almost like a brick wall. It doesn't really let a lot of energy past our cutoff frequency through. So this is really a handy filter. The only thing I don't like about it is that it doesn't self-oscillate. So if we unplug that white noise, crank the resonance all the way up, we don't hear anything. It doesn't self-oscillate. It doesn't produce a tone itself. So it's just a regular filter in that regard. So if you want something to self-oscillate, you'll have to use that VCF, the fundamental filter. There is also a Bog Audio fixed filter bank, which contains 12 different bandpass filters, each set to a different frequency. It's kind of like a giant equalizer almost. And it's also got a low pass and high pass filter built into it. So 12 bands plus low pass and high pass. It's really handy to run noise through. I'm not going to go over using it right now, but I encourage you guys to take a look at it and explore it. You'll see at the bottom there, it's got 3 different outputs. One that outputs all the bands, one that outputs only the odd numbered bands. So if you were to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, it's only going to let through the bands with odd numbers, and then the even output will do the opposite with the even numbered bands. So that's cool to explore on your own. But now let's end by talking about doing some things with unique signal paths. So we've talked about all semester how the basic signal path on most analog synthesizers is start with a VCO, go through the VCF, end with the VCA. But I mentioned last week that in modular synthesis, these modules can be arranged in any order. So I'm going to clear out some of this stuff here, and we're going to create a patch using a unique signal path where we're doing things in the wrong order, where we're not going to go VCO, VCF, VCA. We'll do things a little differently. So I'm going to start here with my MIDI in. It's coming from my QWERTY keyboard. And instead of using an oscillator to generate our sound, let's use a filter. Because remember, filters can self-oscillate, so they can generate their own sounds. So I'm going to send the volts per octave input from my keyboard to the frequency of my filter. I'm just going to crank that Freak CV knob all the way up. And then let's take our audio output from our filter here. And we're going to send that to our analyzer and then through our analyzer into our mixer. And then let's just crank up that resonance so that we get a tone. And now, because this is all the way up, I can actually play melodies on my keyboard. And our filter is generating our tone instead of our oscillator. So that's kind of cool. All right, so now let's add a VCA, and we'll use this VCA to modulate the volume of our sound. So we're gonna add an LFO as well. Let's put this on the other side. And we're gonna use this LFO, let's say a pulse wave LFO, a square wave, and give us some amplitude modulation. So we have a little bit of tremolo there. And now we'll add an envelope generator. Now, normally we use these envelope generators to control our volume, but we've got something else doing that right now. We're using the LFO to give us some amplitude modulation. So instead of using the ADSR to shape our volume curves, we're going to use the ADSR to change the speed of our LFO. So first we need something to trigger the ADSR, so let's just use the keyboard. So I'm going to take the gate from the keyboard, send that into the gate of the ADSR. So now whenever I play a new note on the keyboard, you can see the lights light up, and we're moving through our ADSR cycle. And so now we're going to send the output of this ADSR to the frequency modulation input on our LFO. And we'll bring up our FM knob a little bit here. So now whenever I press a key and let go, we can hear that envelope. I'm going to go ahead and send both of these to the scope. So here's our envelope, and then here's our LFO. So you can see how the LFO speeds up during the attack, comes down a little bit during the sustain, and then gets even slower during the release. All right, so we've got a VCF, we've got a VCA, an LFO, an ADSR. So what we don't have is a VCO. So let's go ahead and add that. That's going to be our last. What is normally our first module is now our last. And let's go ahead and send the sawtooth wave from the VCO out. And then let's take this whole patch that we made over here, and we're going to use that to modulate the sync of our sawtooth wave here. So as we move this higher, remember whenever we sync two oscillators together, they're going to have the same pitch. So the pitch of this VCO is going to be determined by the pitch of our filter. I can still play melodies. So as I play different melodies, I start these envelopes, which change our LFO speed, and that produces different pitches through this VCO. But the VCO isn't getting pitches from the keyboard, it's getting its pitches from being synced to this signal that's coming all the way from the filters. So yeah, it doesn't sound amazing. We could maybe come up with some different things. In fact, I challenge you guys, see what you can come up with by arranging these modules in different orders than what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing VCO, VCF, VCA, but see what you can come up with by doing these things in different, less conventional orders. Okay, so today we talked about VCAs. We talked about using VCAs for volume and also amplitude and ring modulation. And then we also talked about how we can use VCAs to shape modulation. Like we can run an LFO through the VCA and then use that to increase and decrease the amount of modulation we have. We'll do a little bit more of that next time with sample and hold. Then we also talked about the difference between attenuators and attenuverters. We talked about envelope generators, looked at the difference between gates and triggers. We looked at using EGs as a control for the VCA, but then also as a control for other modules like the oscillator, or as we just did in this patch just now, as a way to change the frequency modulation or the speed of an LFO. We talked about noise. We reviewed the difference between pink and white noise, but then talked about a bunch of other noise colors like red, violet, blue, black, and gray. We talked about filters, looked at the fundamental VCF, talked about things like filter slope, drive, and then also different ways we can modulate or shape the filter with LFOs or envelope generators. We then talked about some third-party modules, looked at the Bufaco attenuverter, and then the Bog Audio VCF and fixed filter bank. And then we ended by looking at some unique signal paths and creating some synthesizers that had the modules not in the conventional East Coast VCO, VCF, VCA signal path. So if you guys have questions, let me know via the discussion board. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys in the next lesson on Wednesday.